The rain drummed softly against the windows of the small, dimly lit restaurant, its golden glow spilling onto the quiet street outside. Inside, the scent of freshly baked bread and simmering broth filled the air, wrapping the cozy space in warmth. Chef Rafik moved with practiced ease behind the counter, his hands swiftly slicing through a fresh batch of vegetables. He had been running this restaurant for years, serving meals with a side of wisdom to the customers who came and went, their stories as varied as the spices he used in his dishes. That evening, the place was nearly empty, save for an older gentleman, sitting at a corner table, stirring his soup absent-mindedly. The man's face was weary, his shoulders slumped under the weight of an untold burden. Something about him caught Rafik's attention, not just the way he kept glancing at the door, as if expecting someone, but the deep sadness in his eyes. Rafik had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who had lost something precious. Curious, the chef approached. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked, placing a fresh piece of warm bread on the table. The man hesitated before nodding slowly. "Just thinking about the past," he murmured, his voice heavy. Rafik pulled up a chair, sensing the man needed someone to listen. "The past has a way of finding us when we least expect it," he said. "Sometimes, sharing the weight makes it lighter." The man exhaled, as if debating whether to speak. Then, after a long pause, he leaned forward and began. "There was a young woman," he said. "A girl, really. I remember her well. She had the kind of laughter that filled a room, the kind of eyes that held stories no one had taken the time to read. She was kind, gentle, and yet her life was not her own to control." Rafik listened intently, his fingers unconsciously tightening around the edge of the table. The man's voice was steady, but the pain underneath it was raw. "She was married off young," the man continued, "to a man she barely knew, a man much older than her. He was wealthy, powerful, and her family saw the match as a blessing. They called it fate." The rain outside grew heavier, matching the weight of the story unfolding. For a while, it seemed she had found a place in his home. She was quiet, obedient, everything a wife was expected to be. But on their honeymoon, something changed. The man swallowed hard, his fingers trembling around his spoon. He sent her back. Rafik's breath caught. "Why?" The man hesitated, then sighed. "Because she was not what he expected." His voice was bitter, filled with restrained emotion. Because when he realized she was not as untouched as he had assumed, he considered her unworthy of being his wife. A heavy silence stretched between them. Rafik felt something stir in his chest, a mixture of anger, sorrow, and disbelief. She was returned to her parents like a broken dish. The man continued, his voice thick, discarded, shamed, and no one asked her side of the story. Rafik's mind raced. He had heard tales like this before, stories of women blamed for things beyond their control, their worth measured in the most cruel and unforgiving ways. But something about this man's pain made it feel personal. What happened to her? Rafik asked quietly. The man lifted his gaze, his eyes glistening with memories. "She survived," he said. "But survival comes at a cost." The chef sat back, exhaling slowly. He could feel that this was just the beginning of a much deeper, more painful tale, one that deserved to be told. And so, in that quiet restaurant, as the storm raged outside, the story began. The man's fingers tapped against the edge of his bowl, his mind lost in a maze of memories. Chef Rafik watched him carefully, sensing the weight of what was left unsaid. The rain outside had softened into a gentle drizzle, but inside, the air remained thick with unspoken emotions. "She was my sister," the man finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her name was Amina." Rafiq felt his chest tighten. The pain in the man's voice was unmistakable. This was not just a story he had heard in passing. This was personal. She was 17 when they married her off. The man continued, his gaze fixed on the table, as if afraid to meet Rafiq's eyes. Our parents thought they had secured a good life for her. A wealthy husband, a respected family. They didn't see the cracks in between. Or maybe they did, and they chose to ignore them. Rafiq nodded, urging him to go on. She didn't say much before the wedding. The man murmured, but I knew she was afraid. Amina was always quiet, always obedient. She never asked for much, never caused trouble. She was the kind of daughter people praised. Until she wasn't. The words hung between them, heavy and bitter. Her husband was a man of status. He was older, experienced in the ways of the world. He had everything: money, power, influence. But what he didn't have was patience. He wanted perfection. The man exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. They left for their honeymoon the night of the wedding. Amina didn't speak much when she got into that car. I remember standing by the gate, watching her disappear down the road, my stomach twisting for reasons I couldn't explain. His fingers curled into fists. When she returned just days later, she was not the same girl who had left. Rafiq swallowed, his heart pounding. She didn't cry when they brought her back. The man said, she just stood there in the middle of our parents' living room, her wedding dress still neatly packed in the suitcase she had barely touched. Her in-laws sent her back as if she were a defective product. Unworthy, unwanted. My mother was the first to speak. She demanded answers. My father, he just sat in silence, staring at the floor, shame already creeping up his spine. Rafiq could imagine the scene, the hushed whispers, the burning stares, the unbearable silence before the storm. What did they say? He asked. The man let out a bitter laugh. They said she had deceived them, that she was not pure, that my sister, the girl who had barely stepped out of our house without my mother's permission, had somehow ruined herself before marriage, and for that, she was no longer fit to be a wife. Rafiq felt anger rise in his chest, and no one questioned it. No one dared, the man said. Not in a world where a woman's worth is measured by things that shouldn't define her. My father, he was humiliated. My mother, she was heartbroken. But she was also afraid, because in their eyes, my sister was now a disgrace, a burden, an unwanted shadow in a house that once saw her as its pride. Rafiq closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of those words. She didn't fight, he asked. The man shook his head. She tried, he admitted. Not with words. Amina was never the type to raise her voice, but in the way she carried herself. She refused to cry. She refused to apologize for something she didn't do. But silence is not always enough to protect you. Rafiq exhaled sharply. What happened to her? The man's fingers trembled slightly, his voice raw. She disappeared. The words hit the air like a thunderclap. Rafiq's stomach twisted. What do you mean? The man's eyes darkened, his voice barely above a whisper. One night, she was just gone. No note, no signs of struggle. Just an empty room and an open window. Some people said she ran away. Others whispered that she had done something worse. His voice cracked. But I know my sister. She wouldn't have left without a reason. Rafiq leaned forward, his heartbeat quickening. And you never found out? The man's jaw clenched. For years I searched, he said. Everywhere, every city, every street. I followed rumors, traced footsteps that led nowhere. But she was like a shadow, there one moment, gone the next. Silence filled the space between them. But I never stopped looking, the man murmured. And now After all these years, I think I finally know where she is. Rafiq's breath hitched. Where? The man lifted his gaze, and for the first time that evening, a spark of something dangerous burned in his eyes. She's here, he said. Somewhere in this city. Rafiq felt his pulse quicken. The night had suddenly taken a different turn, and something told him this was only the beginning. Rafiq stared at the man across the table, his pulse quickening. The air in the small restaurant felt heavier now, thick with something unspoken. She's here, Rafiq repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded, his hands gripping the edges of the table as if steadying himself. I have reason to believe so. A few weeks ago, I heard a name. Not hers, but close enough. A woman working at a small shop. Someone who never speaks about her past. It made me wonder. Rafiq felt a strange pull in his chest. He didn't know Amina, but he could feel the weight of her story, the way it had shaped this man sitting in front of him. He had spent years searching, chasing shadows, hoping to find the sister who had vanished without a trace. And now, she was possibly within reach. Did you see her? Rafiq asked. The man exhaled, his fingers trembling slightly. No, not yet. I've been afraid. Afraid of what? That she won't remember me, that she won't want to see me. His voice was raw with emotion. What if she's built a new life? What if finding her means bringing back everything she tried to escape? Rafiq understood. Sometimes the past was a prison, and sometimes breaking free meant leaving behind the people you loved. But before he could say anything, the door to the restaurant creaked open. The sound was unremarkable, but something about it sent a shiver through Rafiq's spine. He turned, his head, his breath catching. A woman stepped inside, shaking the rain from her scarf. She moved quietly, her steps careful, almost hesitant. She was older than the girl in the man's memories. But there was something familiar in the way she held herself, dignified yet guarded, as if bracing for a world that had not been kind to her. The man beside him went completely still. Rafiq didn't need to ask. He knew. The woman glanced around, her eyes briefly meeting Rafiq's before shifting to the man at the table. For a moment, there was nothing. Just silence, thick enough to stop time itself. Then, she inhaled sharply. Her lips parted slightly, as if forming a name she wasn't sure she should say. The man stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. His eyes were wide, searching, desperate for confirmation. Amina, the woman froze. A single breath passed before she spoke. Brother! The word was soft, barely there, but it was enough. The man's face crumbled, years of grief and longing rushing to the surface, all at once. Amina didn't move right away. She seemed to be weighing something in her mind, caught between the past and the present. But then, with a deep breath, she took a step forward. The man reached for her hesitantly, as if afraid she would disappear again. But she didn't. And then, just like that, she was in his arms. Rafiq looked away, giving them their moment. He felt a strange warmth spread through him. A quiet kind of relief. Some wounds never fully heal. But sometimes, life gives you a second chance. Outside, the rain had finally stopped.